All right. Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today we have a special treat. Somebody's returning who was just on last week, Pam Moon. Hey, Pam.
Hello. Thank you so much for letting me come back.
No problem. No,
Yeah.
I'm definitely looking forward to seeing you present your full case and that sort of thing. Obviously, when we have four panelists, as the host, I'm trying to juggle and stuff. So it'll be great to kind of here's your full case. And also joining me as a co-host, we also have Teddi Pappas. Hey, Teddy.
Hi, how are you? How are y'all?
I'm good. I'm good. Welcome back. So basically, the goal for today is Pam is going to make her two presentations. I think the first is on the historical gap period from 1204 to 1355, and then the second is where the shroud was prior 1204 and before. So, Pam, I'll throw it open to you if you want to start sharing your screen.
Okay, let's see if I can work out how to make it work like I couldn't last week. So let's see, share screen. So it's this one. Share. So I wonder if it's come up.
Yep, it's popping up, and I'll change it to cinema layout. So the full screen is the PowerPoint.
So people are seeing the full screen, are they now?
Yep.
Let me just work out how I, if I change that, does it work?
Yeah, you might want to, and just
make it into where is it? Where do you put it from the?
Play from start, I think.
So that does that cover the whole screen?
Yep.
Okay, lovely. Well, thank you so much for letting me have a chance to show this rather than just talk about it. So I talked about my mother having seen a black and white negative of the Shroud, and she told me about Ian Wilson's books and David Rolfe's film, The Silent Witness, and just a shout out to David's latest film, Who Can He Be?, which is a great film. So in 2008, having done a few years of doing talks on the Shroud, I wrote to Barry Schwartz because I wanted to see if I could buy something that my mother had seen and take to people to show them. And he wrote back, as Barry amazingly often does, immediately by return, and said that he'd got 4 copies of the Shroud as it was in its full length that he just had made, and I was blessed to get one of them. So I put together an exhibition, and I was really, again, blessed that one of the first people to come to the exhibition was the man who's now the current Cardinal of England, Vincent Nichols, a very godly man. And he opened the doors for us to go to lots of places like Westminster Cathedral. So this is the Shroud. And I've got some black and white negatives I also bought, and I've had a fantastic team who've worked alongside me. So I've just put their names up there to thank them for the work that they've done. One of the exhibits is this. It's a Rolling Stone tomb at a place called Kibbut Midras. It's a 1st century. It's been vandalized now, so the stone's gone. But it's just to tell that story of the stone rolled back and the tomb was empty apart from the grave clothes and angels, actually, the Bible text tells us. Now, one of the things I have is a blown up image of the face, which is 7 foot high, and the Bible tells us to seek the face of the Lord, to seek his face. And over the years, I've learned a lot about, so this is just some background of my exhibition, if that's okay. And then I'll go on to talk a little bit about the carbon date from what we would, the prompting from the last interview that we had. Okay, so here is the face. It's beautiful. One of the STURP scientists, Don Lynn, said, the body is very beaten up, and yet the face is very serene. So one of the reasons I use the face a lot is it's the authenticity of the Bible. So have a look at this quote from Isaiah. I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I didn't hide my face from insults and spitting. So if you look here, there's a huge bruise to the right cheek and a whiplash just below it. And the beard is divided in the middle, pulled out. So we know that the back is covered in welts from the whip, and yet here is another whip to the cheek, and the beard is pulled out. It's an Old Testament prophecy that finds fulfillment in the shroud. And one of the things that interests me is the sort of non-violence of that. Jesus said, I say to you, do not resist an evildoer, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. Now, this is somebody who practiced what he preached. He has a bruise to the right cheek and a whiplash to the right cheek, and yet he allowed them to crucify him. And I've got a note down at the bottom for the Jalsa Salana. So the Review of Religions team from the Ahmadiyya Muslim community have invited us for 5 years to come and discuss the shroud. And they've invited Barry, who's a Jew, and many, many Christians like Bruno Barbaras and Manuela Manarelli and Mark Guskin, actually, and Hugh have been. And this wonderful community with Amir Safir and Arif Khan, they invite people to talk in peace. So here we have Jews and Muslims and Christians talking in peace. And that the whole bruise to the right cheek has always been very resonant for me because it was raised at that event, at those events over 5 years. Also, it's a color-blind image. It's completely non-racist. If you look at the color of the image, you get the red of the blood, this carmine red of the blood, and then you get the image, which is very, very faint, 15% different to the background cloth. Scientists would argue it was created by light or radiation or some other phenomenon. But we don't know the color of his hair. We don't know the color of his skin. We don't know the color of his eyes. This is universal man. And I think that, you know, after George Floyd, that's been such an important thing to me, that, that if it's created by light, then it's all the colors of the rainbow. Okay, the number 3 bloodstain on the forehead. I've had children, can you see this here? I've had children say to me, does Jesus have a number 3 on his forehead to remind us of the Trinity? There's this complex medical term, which I won't pronounce because I'll probably mispronounce it, which talks about sweating blood. Now, I've run a viscous fluid down my forehead to try and create the curves of this shape, and I haven't been able to do it. What you get is lines from where the crease marks on your forehead are. So I have wondered if this is some form of a pre-crucifixion wound that Christ suffered. Now, it has, in my opinion, enormous significance spiritually. So Russell Brewer, the great apologist for the shroud, has argued that it's very like the cursive of the Hebrew letter Sade, which stands for the righteous one. Karen Jacks talked to me about the fact that if you rotate it so it goes like an M, it looks like the shape of the Golden Gate in Jerusalem, which has very great significance spiritually. But for me, this is quite important. This is how the Hebrew letter Shin was written 2,000 years ago. It looks like a W. The significance of it is it's the first letter of the word Shaddai, which is translated as God Almighty. It's the first letter of the word Shalom, which is the peace and the wholeness. It's the first letter of Shekinah, which is the presence and the glory of God. It's the first letter of Shema, you know, the great prayer of Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And it's the letter that's found on the mezuzah. So following the Passover, Jews keep the mezuzah with the letters, the words of the Shema in it on their doorways. And this is the letter that's on it. And then you go to St. John in Revelation, this great prophecy of the future. They will see his face and his name will be on their foreheads. Okay, let's go down to a bit of history. So the sack of Constantinople in 1204, absolute chaos, carnage. They looted everything and spread it out all over Europe. Now, Barbara Frail, I don't really know a lot about this period, but Barbara Frail has argued that from the Vatican archives that the shroud went with the Knights Templar, probably via Athens into Europe. Now, Jacques de Molay, this is his death in 1314. He was the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, who was burnt at the stake in 1314 for heretical practices, including the veneration of an image which had 2 heads and 4 feet, which I argued last week is a very good description of the shroud. Now, did it come to England? This is the William Blake poem. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? Well, the answer to the first 2 is probably no, but the answer to the third may be yes. It may be that the shroud travelled around England. So this is Glastonbury, which has it's got a very sort of sacred place. In lots of ways, it has been over the centuries. This is Glastonbury Tour. It's kind of world famous because of this, the Glastonbury Festival, where multiple artists come and perform. But Ian Wilson and Juliet Faith, a friend of mine who wrote a book called The Knights Templar in Sunset, have argued that this temple coombe panel may have been the box lid of a box in which they stored the shroud. Okay, we're going to talk. I was asked last week to talk a little bit about carbon dating, and so if you don't mind, I'll talk a little bit about that now. So, yep. Folding patterns on the shroud. So Ian Wilson, John Jackson have argued that the shroud is folded. You can see multiple crease lines in raking light across the top of the head, and more here, and then there's other creases. So the Holy Mandelian idea is that it was folded so that just this is visible. And then the Man of Sorrows image, which is prevalent from the 12th century, you just get this image here. Now, in 2012, I went to a Shroud conference there where David Rolfe, who was the editor of the BSTS then, Michael Kowalski is the editor now, argued that, he just said, the carbon date is like a dead hand on people's interest in the shroud. So I got a model, I printed off a copy of Ari's image, and I folded, double-sided, and I folded it and folded it and folded it to try and understand the different folding patterns that you can see on the shroud. Now, this is a strip that's attached to the shroud, and you can see that 2 corners are present and 2 corners are missing. So that was one of the first questions I wanted to ask myself, because the carbon date was taken from this corner here. So why is this corner missing and this corner present? And what are all these? What's this? What's the history for this? And how was the shroud folded during these things? So let's have a go at this. This is the carbon date area here, taken next to this missing corner. And you can see it's a different colour, it's orange, whereas this is the background, more the background colour of the cloth. It's actually quite similar to the colour of burn damage here. So let's have a look at the burn damage. This is, you can see these triangles here. They are from replacement patches that were put in place after the fire. And you can work out exactly how the shroud was folded because of it. So it was folded straight down the middle and then down again, down this burn line, and then folded across like this. I'll come to that in a minute. There's water damage here from where the doused water was used to put the fire out. Now there's another pattern which is called the diamond-shaped pattern. You can see it here on the chest. Can you see? That's quite. I'm going to talk about this quite a bit later on. You can see it above the head, and you can see it here around the knees. Now, they're 2 separate incidents, and you can tell that because of the back of the man on the shroud. So here is the diamond pattern on the back of the legs, here are the feet. And this is the water damage, the fire from 1532 and the water damage here. So they don't match. These triangles are in a different place to this diamond shape. So it's 2 separate incidents. But there's another reason for thinking that it's 2 separate incidents, and that is to do with how the water was applied. So in this instance, the fire damage from 1532, the shroud is folded down the middle and down the edge here, and then folded into layers and laid horizontally, and the fire and the water come from above. Now, this is an example of a medieval European chest in which cloth is stored, and it was always stored horizontally in the European model. Now it's different in this. Now for this pattern, it's folded down the middle again, and then concertinaed up, and the water comes from the bottom. Now I did lots and lots of experiments in my kitchen with bits of tea, cups of tea, and bits of folded cloth to try and work out how to create this central pattern, which is mirrored here at the sides. And basically, this is the center at which point the water entered, and then it comes to form that shape. And to do that, you have to have the cloth vertical, which is a Middle Eastern form of storage. So this is a clay jar from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you can see that water coming in from the bottom here could have slightly damaged the shroud and spread through. Now this is incense damage. Can you see there are 4 patterns of burn marks? This is the largest here, this inverted L shape, and then the second largest, then this is the next one, and this is the smallest. As the incense resin burnt through the shroud, it became less and less as it went through. Now this is obvious how it was folded. It was folded straight down the middle and then across the top of the head to create that pattern. Now, before we move on to the carbon date, can you just look for a minute at this image? So this is Lucas Cranach the Elder, who drew an image of Christ as the Man of Sorrows in 1515, before the fire. Now, Cranach is a medieval grandmaster of the same, a Renaissance grandmaster, as gifted as Leonardo, German rather than Italian, and so in my opinion, he must have seen the shroud. And the reasons for that is, can you see the depth of the crown of thorns here? Which is very consistent with what you can see on the back of the head of the man of shroud, on the shroud. And also look at these whiplashes. They're very, very accurate to the shroud. You get like a dumbbell, a ball at one end, and then a line across. They're all over the body. And you can see them coming down the arms. Now this is significant because this predates the fire. So this is the only evidence we have of what the arms of the man on the shroud would have looked like before the fire. And you can see that the whiplashes are consistent across the arms as well as across the chest. He also picks up this right dislocated shoulder, which is clear on the shroud. Now, the reason I talk about this is because of this image. I've tried to argue that Cranach did this. It was done in 1516, and this looks like his signature LC, and it has like a serpent over the top, which was the insignia that he used. Now, you can see that there's the burn marks from the incense here on this image, and it's not a bad representation of the shroud. It's a very difficult thing for artists to recreate. But what I really want to talk about is the feet. Can you see that there's blood flow here, and then there's toes on the Liège shroud before the fire? Now, post the fire, here is the blood flow to the front of the foot, and there are no toes. So what's happened to the cloth that the toes are missing? And I think this arc of water damage is a clue. This is the water stain pattern. You might think that this is the triangular, the diamond shaped pattern, but it isn't. This is water damage. Can you see it's arced around this fire damage here? And can you see that this is consistent with the height of the missing corner? Okay. Now, if you look at the back of the shroud, this is actually quite a lot of cloth missing. I think it's 34 centimeters, which is a lot. And I know people have argued, Jo Marina, I think, has argued that this was taken for relics. I'm not wholly convinced by that, but I may be wrong. But Jo's a great scholar. But can you see that the water damage here, I've traced it around. This is the water damage on the back of the shroud. It's again consistent with this missing corner. So if the shroud is damaged by water, and the reason that these corners are missing is because of water damage, and actually if you look closely here, certainly on my shroud, you can see what looks like black marking from mold. If this was surgically removed because of water damage, then you would expect some form of disinfecting to be done in this area to try and preserve the cloth. And from carbon dating point of view, you can't carbon date something that's been damaged by disinfectant. It's just one of those things that it makes the carbon dating null and void. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about Joe and Sue and Dr. Ray Rogers have done so much to promote the idea that the sample was contaminated. And I'm going to look at some of the evidence that I hope I've been able to add and contribute to what they found. So in 2014, I put a Freedom of Information request on Oxford University, and this is one of their images of the shroud. P2575 is their classification for the shroud. And this is clearly the shroud because it's herringbone weave. Now, you can see that it's orange and it's covered in a whole load of gunk. Can you see all these bits and pieces here that shouldn't be there? Now, this is an image from 1978 done by Mark Evans. And this is what the shroud should look like. So this is the background colour of the cloth, which is very white in many ways. It's just a slight linen. Well, it's a linen colour, and this is the marks that create the image, a slight discoloration, a slight change in the outer fibres of the cloth. Fibrils, not fibres, just the measured in nanometers. And compare the two. They don't look anything like the same. It doesn't look like it ought to. So I sent the Oxford photos to Donna Campbell, who is a textile expert at Thomas Ferguson Irish Linen, and she examined it. Now, this is the full sample. And can you see that this side, which is actually the side nearest to the body of the shroud, the full body of the shroud, this is nearest to the edge, is a different weave size to this. It's much tighter. This is much, much looser. There's a lot more gaps in between. This is much, much tighter. So something weird has gone on with this side of the shroud. Joe and Sue argued that it was a patch inserted. I've argued that maybe it's that they unravelled it and then attached it, adding new fibres into it, but certainly half of the sample looks completely different to the other half. Donna also picked up the fact that there's some linear staining, she calls it, so patterns of staining, which is like a dye, which is going across. This is the reverse of the sample. So this is the side that's loosely woven, and this is the side that's tightly woven. She also picked up some imperfections. So this is all weird, it's missing stitches. And there's this, which looks like stitches on the bias. This was a crease that runs through the Oxford sample. And maybe these stitches and repairs is what created the crease. Donna certainly said that there's lots of evidence of stitching and repair. Also this, consideration of the black thread, the suggestion that the thread could have been used to reinforce the fabric. No such thread is obvious on the control samples. You can see it here. It's quite clear, a thread that shouldn't be there. Now, we know that Blessed Sebastian Valfrey repaired the shroud in 1694. And he said this very profound thing to me. The cross received the living Jesus and gave him back to us dead. The shroud received the dead Jesus and restored him to us alive. Now, we have examples of Blessed Sebastian Valfrey's handiwork. This is the spear wound here on the right side, the ellipse where it's on the side, sideways on, but this is the ellipse where the wound entered, and this is the blood flow down. Now, just have a look at what's going on here. There are two patches. This is, I would argue, a patch that was done perhaps immediately after the fire. And then we have, so 1532-ish, 34. Then we have Blessed Sebastian's black stitching here, which was 1694. And then on the top of it is some beautiful stitching and another patch. Now, Blessed Sebastian had a go at the the dorsal side. This is the 34 centimetre missing side piece, side strip. And can you see that there's black stitching here holding it in place? So the assumption would be that he'd also done the carbon plate area here, but actually he didn't, or at least it was redone. Perhaps it was redone later. That's what I probably want to argue. There's no evidence for black stitching around here. But you can see the odd black stitch. This is the Oxford photo blown up. But more to the point, you can see white stitching, which I would argue is a more modern repair, 19th century. So can you follow? There's a knot here, and then this thread comes round and then up, around here, around there, and around there. That is not original. to the shroud. That is an extra stitch that's more modern. Now, Barry Schwartz took some photos of the Arizona, and his photographs are fantastic. And if you look at this, is the reverse of the Arizona sample. There are multiple stitches that go across it. Now, if you blow these up on an iPad, you will see that they have a twist to them. This is not fibers of the shroud. They're too small to be yarn, but they're too big to be fibers. But they've also got a twist to them. This is repair work. There it is a bit more clearly. Can you see? These are repair stitches holding it together. And I wonder whether that's what they did. Possibly they unraveled it, or whatever. The repair involved stitching across, and we've no idea how many stitches there are underneath the surface. These are the ones we can see on the top. We've no idea how many there are underneath. Now, some of this information was presented in the Secrets of the Bible, a show for World Media News, I think it's called, and with Professor Giulio Fanti. But can we just carry on just a little bit more, because I want to talk about the dye that was involved in dyeing the shroud. This is an image taken by Lino Salatino, and can you see that this is the shroud about to be cut? This is Professor Rigi cutting it here, and can you see that the shroud that he's cutting is orange, and the normal shroud should be a whitish colour. But the orange is very similar to the colour of the bird. What I've tried to argue is that one of the repairs was to try and make this area, which couldn't have been burnt by the fire, look like it was burnt by the fire. So they dyed it to look the same colour. Now, this is a close-up. Can you see this is the backing cloth on which the shroud lay? This is unbleached cotton, and this is obviously dyed. And the shroud is the same colour as the dyed bit of the fabric. So what was the dye? Well, Ray Rogers discovered that it was madder root dye, and it was also carried gum tragacanth, which, well, that's what's normally used in linen, gum tragacanth, rather than gum arabic. So this is thread 14 of the Reyes sample, but he also found similar results in the shroud sample when he was sent examples of that. So this is after 6N of hydrochloric acid. You can see that the dye has come out, the madder root dye has come out of the fibres, but the gum stayed until he used concentrated hydrochloric acid. Now, the labs used about 1.5 N of hydrochloric acid. So they will have tested their samples with the dye and the gum present. Now, they've also, Robert Villarreal, I was privileged to sit next to him actually at a conference in America. He discovered that this fibre, this is thread 1 of the Reyes sample. This is cotton and this is linen. This is orange, dyed with madder root dye, and this is not, the cotton absorbs the dye much better than the linen. So I would argue that this picture from Oxford University would say that the carbon date is meaningless, because they didn't do any science on it to identify what the contaminants were, and so consequently they wouldn't have known the extent or the severity of the contaminants. Okay, so that's the first half of the presentation. Do you want me to just carry on?
No. All right, hang on. We'll take a break. I'm just going to take it out of cinema mode here. All right, cool. So yeah, in terms of that presentation, so I have a few questions. I'm going to before I turn it to Teddi, and not only have her ask questions, I'm going to ask her for her take as well. But
okay, great.
So the first question I had here in your presentation, so I noticed you mentioned a prophecy in the prophet Isaiah, and you said, the shroud band perfectly fits this. Now, I've had a lot of shroud skeptics who are Christians quoting Isaiah and saying, no, well, the shroud is inconsistent because there's a prophecy that says he'll be beaten beyond all human likeness and form. So I'm not sure if you've encountered that objection, but like, how do you respond to that?
I haven't, but one of the things that I find most moving about the shroud is the sheer extent of the whiplashes that cover the body. I mean, in 2014, Italian scientists and medics with Giulio Fanti counted the number, and obviously they couldn't count the number down the arms because of the missing arms with the fire damage, and they worked out that there were hundreds, 300 to 400 different lashes. And bear in mind that some people died at the time of Christ with 40 lashes. And if you going back to Cranach, he did a lot of other images of Christ, which are full body images, and he depicted the body absolutely covered in blood. And I used to, the Mel Gibson film, which where the whipping scenes are so horrific, but actually, it's far more than what artists would generally depict. But actually, it's much more realistic to what happened on the Shroud. I think they used shorter whips, but it's much more realistic to the extent of the damage.
Okay, awesome. All right, cool. So my next question relates, so I noticed you linked, and this is something I do as well, so I agree, but you linked the Shroud to this Man of Sorrows icon.
Yes.
Now, one thing is with these Man of Sorrows icons there, they do date, all the way up to the 1400s as well. So how do we know? What if somebody says, well, the Shroud was based on the Man of Sorrows? It wasn't the other way around. The Man of Sorrows wasn't based on the Shroud. How would you respond if someone's said that objection?
Well, actually, to be honest with you, I want to go on and talk about the Man of Sorrows in the next bit, and talk about some of the things that you can find that are present on the Shroud that is also present in the art that predates 1204.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So we'll put a pin on that. Very cool. Okay, so you also mentioned the fold patterns. So this is, again, something that I personally disagree with, but I remember you and Hugh in the show last week kind of going back and forth, and you saying, well, look, you're making sure there are these fold patterns, but those could have come at any time. Maybe when someone was, I forget, Marguerite, I think her name was, when she was lugging it around Europe, maybe she folded it up into all sorts of things or something like that. And
sure. Yeah. My problem with it, and my argument towards Hugh would be, okay, so the Shroud is pretty well documented from 1340 onwards, 1355 onwards, 1356. And we've got quite good history going back to that. So what I want is a date and a time. Do you know what I mean? So for instance, take the incense damage. I want to be able to say, okay, it happened in this church at this time, and it was recorded on this document, triple, and we've got, in different documents where they recognise that this is what had happened to it. You know what I mean? Because we sometimes underestimate the Shroud. I mean, I've been to see it twice in Turin, and 2 to 3 million people come, even after the radiocarbon date would suggest it might be a fake. I would argue with that, having just gone through what I think is wrong with the carbon date. So it has a profound effect on people. So I think if it was damaged by incense, or if it was damaged by the diamond-shaped water pattern, somewhere there would be some history of that. A date and a time, a place and a church, and it was happening during this ceremony. And what I'm going to go on and argue is that I think you can find those bits of history, those specific times and dates in manuscripts that go back before 1204.
Gotcha. Perfect. All right, cool. And last question before I turn it to Teddi. I can see she's raring to go on her end. So, okay, so you mentioned with the carbon dating, you gave these very interesting things about the various evident contaminants on the Shroud samples that were carbon dated and that sort of thing. Now, one question here is, obviously they engaged in certain cleaning procedures. Wouldn't that have taken care of all this stuff?
No. I mean, one of the things is, if the missing corner is missing because of water damage, then you would anticipate that and certainly the dorsal side shows signs of the black marking that you get with mold, in my opinion. I don't think it's just shadow that shows little black spots. Then you would expect some disinfectant. And, so I asked the labs at Oxford if they had autoclaved the sample before they tested it. Because obviously with bacterial contamination, most bacteria isn't a problem, but endospores is a problem because they have a very hard coating. And if you went into a theatre to have an operation, the linens that we used in that theatre would be autoclaved to remove the endospores from them. So I asked, was the shroud autoclaved? And the answer came back that they didn't want to damage it. So they didn't use high heat on it, but what also we know from the articles that they produced in Nature that the amount of hydrochloric acid that they use to clean it, and it's nothing like the concentrations that Ray Rogers showed would be needed to remove it. So I think it's a sixth of the amount to remove the madder root dye and a 12th of the amount to remove the gum tragacanth. Gum tragacanth is like it's a bit like gum arabic chewing gum, but it's stickier. And because linen doesn't absorb dye very well, you have to use it. I went to a linen specialist, a dye specialist, who told me that you need gum tragacanth because linen just doesn't absorb the dye. So they just didn't use anywhere near the kind of concentrations necessary to remove it.
Gotcha. Awesome. All right, cool. Well, that does it for my follow-up questions. So Teddi, I want to turn it to you. Before you ask your questions, though, if you don't mind, maybe take between 5 and 10 minutes. What is your take on this question about where the shroud was during this gap period between 1204 and 1355? If you have an opinion, what's your take?
I do. I think that there's a strong likelihood that one of the Templar Knights got it, maybe a Thun de la Roche. But I think my most important take on that whole issue is that it really doesn't matter. And in the law, there's this Latin expression that says it's res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. And also going back to just, my background being a lawyer and criminal defense work. And I think about the issues of let's say you have a murder case and then there's a murder weapon that was used. Let's say it's a knife to stab someone. And when the police first go to the scene, they see that somebody's been stabbed, there's blood, there's DNA evidence, but they don't have the weapon. And they're looking for the weapon. And let's say that at some point later on, months, years, that doesn't matter, the knife is found and it has DNA evidence on the blade from the victim's blood, and on the handle it's got DNA from someone else, and it's just let's just say it's just one person's DNA that can be tracked down on the handle. It doesn't matter in terms of a chain of evidence to show where that knife has been from the time of the murder until the time of its discovery. If what is on that knife is enough to show the connection between who was holding it and who it killed, that's enough. And I think that throughout history, and one of my favorite things, which I was disappointed to see that it wasn't really gone into with that last panel review that was done, because to me, I think that the image of Edessa is beyond a reasonable doubt the Shroud of Turin. And I think that the things that the details with regard to it, in terms of the details of Gregory Referendarius's sermon the day after the image of Edessa was brought to Constantinople in 944. There was all this fanfare when the image of Edessa was brought to Constantinople.
Okay.
With,
bear in mind, the next presentation we do is going to be the Shroud from 1204, from the first century up to 1204. So if you have your take on evidence before 1204, save that for the next.
Okay.
Round. Yeah.
Is it on this?
This one's kind of. This one's kind of like the gap. It's going to be
But my major takeaway is the evidence as to when we look at it and look at what the Shroud shows chemically and in the physics-based tests, and we see that all of the evidence points to this being an image not created by human hands, and we see historically evidence of people talking about this, then who cares? I mean, not who cares, maybe that's a little flippant, but it doesn't truly matter where it was during that period. I mean, there are, first of all, we have an abundance of very viable hypotheses as to where it could have been and who took it. And so, yay for that. But we don't have to pinpoint it for us to absolutely win on the point that what was seen by Gregory, is the same thing that pops up in Larry, France, and it's the same thing that we see in Turin, Italy today, whenever we get a chance to see it. But so anyway, that's my take on that.
I totally agree with your take. I think that is a unique thing that you bring to the table, this issue of the chain of custody. We don't need to prove every second of where this shroud has been. I mean, we've got proof of certain elements, but yeah. So before we get into the second part of the presentation, Teddy, do you have any questions or things you'd like to ask Pam about her first presentation here?
Yes, so I'm not totally clear, and I'd like for you to get into this a little bit more. The issue with the toes and the water damage, are you thinking that the water damage has influenced the lack of image? I mean, what are you? I'm not clear on what your position is.
Yes, I would say exactly that. I would say that if you look at, well, I can't say for sure that it's Grenache because I've never had that, authenticized, but it looks like it to me. Mm-hmm. But so you could argue that either he made it up, but this is if it is Grenache, he's a very, very accomplished painter, and he drew what he saw. And I'm going to come back to the toes in the next section. So, because there's lots of evidence from art that Jesus had long toes, exactly like the Lear shroud presents it. But so, yeah, I mean, what causes the missing toes? And the most obvious answer is water damage. And I actually think that the toes have been removed. They're no longer there. There just isn't enough room between the blood flow on the front of the foot and where the end of the toes would have been for them still to be there on the shroud. So I would say that the water damage, this is my own personal, and it may be wrong, was so catastrophic they had to remove some of the front of the foot, the tips of the toes.
Okay.
I remember meeting John Jackson, honoured to meet him at St. Louis, and he St. Louis. Sorry, I get mixed up with how the pronunciation.
Is the American way of saying it, but
sorry,
both say it both ways actually.
Can you? But and he said, because I showed him the Lear shroud, and he said he'd always been interested in what the toes would have been like, because actually Jesus has on the shroud, the man of the shroud has long fingers. So you would anticipate that anatomically he would have long toes.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? So yeah, I think the only explanation is water damage, really, personally.
Well, one of the interesting things with the long fingers, because a lot of people, will point that out, but then I've heard other arguments talk about how that could be just sort of that whole X-ray-ish appearance where you're actually just seeing more of the bones kind of peeking through, and that gives the appearance of more elongated fingers. So I don't know, and of course that could do that with toes as well.
Yes, but I mean, at the moment on the shroud we can't tell. So I mean, I suppose that one of the reasons I showed the Cranach image, which is Cranach of Christ of the Man of Sorrows in 1515, is because the arms, he'd seen it.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue. I mean, it's so accurate to what was. Do you know what I mean? So what was there before? Yeah.
And I get one of the things too, in terms of the issue with the yellow matter dye.
Yes.
I had gotten curious about that, and I found out that yellow matter, it has a preservative effect, and so then that got me thinking, if it's got preservative qualities, and if I recall correctly, on Beta Analytics, the largest radiocarbon dating company in the world, from what I've read, they've even talked about how, when you're radiocarbon dating textiles, you want to be sure that there aren't any preservatives on it. So now, how much could it have affected the radiocarbon date? I don't know, but
I mean, I think that's exactly it. We just don't know what all the contaminants were,
mm-hmm.
and there was no science done on it to identify those contaminants in 1988. So it's who knows? I mean, obviously the most likely medieval, if the toes are missing because of water damage, and there's a folding pattern I've tried to work out. So I have a backing cloth that I put my shroud on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and normally I would fold it in the way that the shroud is folded. So I'd fold it center down the middle and then fold it and lie it flat. Mm-hmm. But if it's wet and I try to dry it, I used to hang it over a banister, and then it would the water would drain down and come out, which leaves an amount of water at the bottom of the cloth, if you see what I mean. As it dries from the top down, and the feet area would remain wetter longer. Now, linen has the capacity to hold 20% of its weight in water and still feel dry to the touch. Now, the fire happened in Chambray in France, which is in the Alps. It happened in December. Now, the humidity levels in Chambray are something like 90%. It was built on the cathedral there was built on 30,000 planks to lift it out of the swamp. Do you know what I mean? So trying to get a cloth dry that had been wet by a fire without putting it anywhere near a fire. They weren't going to put it anywhere near a fire, let's be honest. Mm-hmm. If they hung it over a balcony, then you might find that the water gathered around the feet area, around the carbon date area. It felt dry to the touch, so they stored it with the two missing corners next to one another. Do you see that hypothesis?
Mm-hmm. Right. And what's interesting
now the most likely medieval disinfectant is pine. It's what they it's thick pine disinfectant. So if the shroud fibers were coated with that to preserve and protect what they could, mm-hmm. then the carbon date is meaningless.
Now, pine, there's resin.
Yes, exactly. It's a tree resin, which is equally as adhesive as gum tragacanth.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I Oh, my favorite guy, Walter McCrone. I just recall between what he said as well as Heller and Adler, they found just very, very small quantities of mold on the shroud. So I don't know. I mean, you kind of wonder what with the was yellow. It was a super thin film of yellow matter dye, as Adrie van der Hoven has
No,
was.
sorry, right. I mean, I think Ray Rogers. I suppose I would agree with. He's not talking about a thin layer. He's talking about madder root dye used, and I would argue that. So, and maybe this is crazy, but it seems to me that if the shroud gets so badly burnt on your watch, and then it goes moldy, you're going to want to cover that up. Do you know what I mean? So what I've argued is that they not only disinfected it, but they painted it to look like fire damage.
Interesting.
Of course, I'm a big I do. I've waffled back and forth over the years on the invisible reweave. At first, when I heard about it, it sounded really good, and then I saw some criticisms of it, and so then I became a little bit more on the fence. But with more and more with Joe's, especially that paper he did about 2 years ago, I'm back in that camp. And so, with me, I sometimes wonder in terms of with the dyeing of the threads to give it an aged appearance, if that could have been what was going on.
I mean, one of the other hypotheses is that I think the corner was probably re-repaired in the 19th century. I think that white stitching that I tried to show that goes across the Arizona, that's 19th century repair, because it's not, you know what I mean? So,
right.
Yeah.
And logically, given that they were always holding it up by the edges, how would it not have needed repair? Thin, I mean, linen?
Well, but the trouble is, I know that's an argument that's used quite a lot, but and I think David Rolfe in his fantastic film alludes to it. My question about it is that the strip that goes the length of the shroud, and I will come on to that in the next presentation, is the bit it's the two ends of the strip that are missing. But they held it in the middle as well. Why didn't that come apart?
It might not be receiving quite as much stress.
Why?
Because it's
So I suppose where I'm coming from is I've got various questions to ask. One, why are two corners present and two corners missing? Why are the feet no longer there if the Lierre shroud is an honest representation? Do you see what I mean? Where are the toes? Why are they no longer there?
But see, to me, the Lierre shroud is very...
Let this be the last question, Teddi. Just to make sure she has time to do the second. Are you covering carbon dating in your second part as well, or
no?
Okay. Okay. Cool. So in that case, I have one question for you on the carbon dating, and then we can move on if you don't mind. But so one of the most forceful objections as to why I reject the invisible reweave was brought up by Bob Rucker, where he's calculated, look, in order for the invisible reweave to be true, 86% of that part of the shroud has to be new material from the 1520s, and that would be obviously visible and stuff like that. And 14% would have to be dating to 30 AD to get the results that we did. So I don't know if you're aware of that objection, but that kind of makes it seem it can't be, because we know it's not 86% material from 1520s.
I don't trust the radiocarbon dating results, and if Bob Rucker is correct, then what he has argued, I mean, it sounds really good. I don't pretend to fully understand it, but I see it as win-win. If we if we can show a great reason why the radiocarbon dating is accurate, yet the shroud is authentic, great. And if we can show reasons why the radiocarbon dating is unreliable, then great. We win no matter what, and that's pretty good deal
Gotcha.
to
Very
me.
cool. So
And I don't find
The thing
radio
is,
dating credible.
I mean, I suppose I don't know if you've ever darned a sock. It's not something we do, don't we? We throw them away, don't we?
Oh,
Yeah.
I do know. Just I have some basic sewing skills.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so there's different forms of invisible, really. You know, where I'm not sure I agree with Joe is whether it's a complete patch that's attached in. Although I do recognise that Donna picked up the fact that they're completely different weaves, on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side as you look at the Oxford photograph. But I keep losing my thread. I'm so sorry. No, I've forgotten what I was going to say, so it can't be important.
No problem.
Yeah.
Go ahead. So there's different views, right? Not everything is the same as Joe Marino. Is that? I think that's the point that you're getting at. Okay, cool. Well, with that said, I do want to give you time. So this is the most important part, kind of thing. This is what apparently Teddy, the icon lover, would.
Oh, that's from the last show. I don't know why that's still on
there. I thought you put that in there to mock me or something.
No.
Okay.
For some reason, that's still showing up from the last show
Okay.
on venerating icons.
All right, cool. So Pam, over to you. This is how can we prove the shroud existed from the time of Christ all the way up to 1204 AD there? What's your evidence on that front?
Okay, let's have a go at that. So do I go to play from the current slide?
Yep.
Does that cover it now?
Yep, it's in cinema mode.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. And I'll try and keep my wits about me for this. So, okay. All the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, say Jesus was buried in a shroud. And I talked about this last week. It's a very unusual thing to say. People don't normally say someone was buried in a coffin. Now, this is Matthew's gospel. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in a clean linen cloth, and placed it on his own new tomb that he'd cut out of the rock. Now, St. John, who saw and believed when he entered the tomb, has more evidence of the napkin around Jesus' head. Now, the Sudarium of Oviedo, of which Mark is a great scholar, as is Jorge Rodriguez, who's also they've both been to the Jalsa. It has an unbroken historical record to the first century Jerusalem, and the blood stains and the blood type match the shroud. So this is the back of the head, this is the mouth, and then as they took Christ down from the cross, they folded this over and more blood came from his mouth and his nose. And this matches. Now, St. John mentions strips of linen. Now, one of those strips goes the length of this cloth, which I've talked about earlier. Dr. John Jackson has shown, you can watch a video of this done by David Rolfe, that the fibres match, the banding of the fibres that go across, so that it was originally part of the shroud and was then reattached. Now, the stitching, according to Dr. Fleury Lemberg, is similar to rare Judean stitching seen at Masada. So that would be 73 AD, was it? It's very ancient, this type of stitching. Now, is the Holy Blood of Bruges another of the strips St. John talks about, plural strips? Now, Dr. Andrew Husselby has commented that medial nerve damage doesn't cause missing thumbs on the shroud. So was the Holy Blood of Bruges used to tie the hands of Jesus together? Now, it's quite consistent practice in Jewish and Muslim funerals to actually tie the hands together, the thumbs or the hands together, because after death they can fall apart with the weight of the arms. In a coffin, in a wooden coffin, the arms would be held together by the wood, but in a shroud burial, there's none of that pressure. So to create the line of the body, often hands are tied together. Now, the Holy Blood of Bruges has the same red coloration as the blood of the shroud. It's been in this casket from Constantinople. It looks like the enamel work, gold and jewels of Constantinople. It's been there in the same casket for 900 years. No science done it on it at all. But you could go tomorrow and see it, and it's beautiful. Just as one more diversion, Dr. Hasselby's also raised the possibility of a yoke crucifixion. So this would allow the arms to be vertical, which conforms to the blood flow of Barini and Galaskelli. So they're arguing that for the blood to flow down the arms at this angle, the arms needed to be vertical on the shroud. In a yoke crucifixion, they're much more likely to be vertical. But also, if you look at the hematoma on the back of the hand here, can you see there's a large hematoma? If the back of the hand was pressed against the crossbeam, then the hematoma wouldn't have formed there because there's a pressure that would have stopped its forming. So it's possible. I think there's biblical reasons why a yoke crucifixion is a possibility, but we won't go into that today. So other New Testament hints. St. Paul, for now we see only reflections in a mirror, then we shall see face to face. And the passage we mentioned at length last week, you foolish Galatians, who's bewitched you before your very eyes? Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. And then I love this passage from Corinthians. For God, who said, let light shine out of darkness, made his light shine into our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. Now, Dr. Gerald White's pointed out the hymn of the pearl, which is the 1st or 2nd century. The image of the King of Kings was embroidered and depicted in full all over it. Now, this is the text of the letter of Jesus to Abgar V. Blessed are you who have believed in me without having seen me. It carries on a little bit. And then after I have been taken up, I will send to you one of my disciples, that he may heal your disease and give life to you and yours. Now, this is a 10th century image of Abgar holding the Holy Mandelion. You can see it's shown here as a landscape with this image not made by hands of Christ. Now, I think the face is probably modelled on Constantine VII, the great Byzantine emperor, but I'll come on to that in a minute. Other ancient references to the letter of Jesus to Abgar, the pilgrimage of Egreria. She was an amazing woman. She went, from Western Europe all the way across to Jerusalem. And this is what she wrote. The letter of Jesus to Abgar V was kept in great reverence in the city of Edessa. Now, the city of Edessa has a river running through it, the Dyson River, which is called the Leaping River, and it flooded in 204, 305, and 415 AD. And you can see that if the shroud had been in a clay jar and they were holding it out of the water, or a little bit of water just touched the bottom of it and spread into the cloth, you could get the diamond-shaped water pattern, which we were talking about earlier. Now, this is the discovery of the Holy Mandelion in 525 AD, found in the walls after a bishop had a vision. They were doing restoration to the walls after, I think, another flood. And they found this image, not made by hands, which became the most important image of Christ in Christendom. Now, iconography following the discovery matches the shroud that Christ Pantocrator at St. Catherine's Monastery. This is 600 AD, and you can see the, I'm sure you're familiar with the linear markings, the long hair, the beard, the large eyes, the raised right eyebrow, this mark on the neck. I personally love these two images. This is the same basilica. And we have the image of Christ in glory with short hair and no beard, and the Christ in glory looking like the shroud. Same cathedral. And this is the full-length body image of Christ. So although this is very ancient, it's not just the face, it's the full length. Now this is, to me, really interesting. Justinian II coin. From the time of the discovery of the Holy Mandelion, the emperors from Justinian I wore the laurus, which represented the winding cloth of Jesus. My friend Joe Bywater found the significance of this for shroud studies. So here we have a Justinian coin, the second coin, which is really early. And you can see the shroud-like face of Christ. And here you have the emperor. He has his crown and he has his laurus. Now the laurus is this long cloth that's wrapped around his shoulders and around his body, representing the winding cloth of Jesus. Now, why would the emperors wear the winding cloth of Jesus around their shoulders if they didn't have it? Doesn't make any sense. Now, this is the most ancient image of a gospel which shows the right-sided wound of Christ. Now, how do we know that Jesus was crucified and had a spear wound through his right side? That's information that comes from the shroud. And here you have this ancient image from 586 showing the spear wound to the right side. And then this is an offering of a sponge here. So how would we know the right side without the Shroud of Turin? Now, I spent years studying this amazing book. I won't mispronounce the author's name, but it's a full-length copy of the Chronicle of John Skylitzes. Skylitzes this is the only surviving manuscript from Constantinople for the age between 811 to 1055. Now, the only surviving copy is called the Madrid Skylitzes, and it is a copy. It isn't the original. So you expect errors in the text and in the images. And it was copied to around 1130. Now, this in the Madrid Skylitzes is the arrival of the Holy Evangelion in 944 AD. So it was brought to Constantinople following the Emperor Romanos I, who sent an army, I believe, of 80,000 people, soldiers, to besiege Edessa to get the image. He gave loads of gold. He gave 200 prisoners to the Muslim rulers who didn't want to part with the shroud, with the Holy Mandelion, because they felt it had protected their city. And so, but they the Byzantine rulers prevailed, and here is the arrival of the Holy Mandelion. You can see it's a cloth with a three-dimensional head being venerated here as it arrives. Now, Romanos I went to a monastery after the arrival of the Holy Mandelion, and his son-in-law Constantine II and his grandson Romanos II, I should say second, not there, it doesn't mention that, became the emperors, the joint emperors. Now, here is Constantine VII, and you can see the familiarity to the Abgar image, and he's wearing his crown and his laurus, being blessed at his coronation by a life-size Jesus, looking like the shroud. Now, this is his son, Romanos II, again with his child bride wearing the laurus. And you can see there's a folding pattern to this laurus into fours. Now look at the similarity. This is very, very ancient. Romanos died in 963. And look at the similarity between the image of the shroud and the image of Christ on this ivory that Romanos created. Now, Constantine VII wrote this fantastic book called the Book of Ceremonies, where he described all the different ceremonies that took place in Constantinople. And this is what he wrote about Easter Sunday. I shall sketch an outline of it as I see it from our concepts of piety. We think of the magisterioi and patricians putting on lauri on the feast of the day of the resurrection of Christ our God as representing his laying out for burial, and they're being made of gold for the splendor of this day as being struck by the rays from the sun at the resurrection of Christ himself. Now, this is a really important artifact that is called the Limburg Staritiki, and it predates 985. It was made by Romanos II and Constantine VII, and it was also made by Basil Lecapenos, who was the half-brother. He was the actual son of Romanos I and the half-brother of Constantine VII. Now, this side was done by Constantine VII and Romanos II, and this side by Basil Lecapenos. Now, this is the Holy Woods. It's the cross on which Jesus was crucified. And there are lots and lots of reliquaries in here. This is Jesus seated enthroned in glory, surrounded by Mary and John and the archangels and the patriarchs of Constantinople. Now, the inscription on the styrotikis contains the words, "The winding sheet Christ was wrapped in while in his tomb." Now, the larger inscription references the passion and the resurrection of Christ. Let's look at it. God stretched out his hands upon the wood, gushing forth through it the energies of life. And Constantine and Romanos, the emperors, have, with the addition of radiant stones and pearls, made this same thing full of wonder. Upon this, Christ formally smashed the gates of hell, giving new life to the dead. And the crowned ones who have now adorned it, crush with it the temerity of the barbarians. So the first bit that Romanos and Constantine VII and Romanos II are saying is that this is about the wood of the cross and the crucifixion, but this is a resurrection image. So if we go back to what Blessed Sebastian Valfrid said about the cross and about the shroud, this can't just be about the holy woods, it's about something more than that. Now this epitassios, dating to 1282 to 1321, I think it's possible to argue that Constantine VII may have originated the epitassios procession. He recounts changing the altar cloth, which has always been associated with Christ's burial shroud. He describes removing it from the altar in the sanctuary at Hagia Sophia on Good Friday and taking it to the chapel of the Holy Casket. It was returned to the cathedral for Easter Sunday celebrations where the emperor wore the laurus. Now notice the diamond pattern here on the center of the chest and the long toes. Now, when the Holy Mandelion was found, it was alongside a tile which was called the Coramion. And this is the Holy Mandelion, here you see with the fringe showing that it's material, shown here in portrait rather than landscape. And this is the tile that showed the same image, probably a painting. And this is the text from the Scalitzes, which says, so along with him, Nicephorus, came the tile which bore the imprint not made with hands of the features of Christ our God. So this arrived in Constantinople in 966 AD. Now in 1031, we get the arrival of the letter of Jesus to Abgar V. So this is Maniakes, the general, sending the letter to the emperor. Here it's held with veiled hands, can you see, because it's so sacred, the letter of Jesus to Abgar V. Now Mark Guskin describes an anonymous Latin text from the 11th century, which reports this wonderful linen cloth with the face of the Lord Jesus, marked by direct contact, is kept in greater veneration than the other relics in the palace and held in such high esteem that it is always kept in a golden case and very carefully locked up. It was not opened by anyone except the Emperor of Constantinople. Just a minute referred to Constantine VII talking about going to the chapel of the Holy Casket, Now, it remained in the golden casket and only opened by the emperor until 1034. And this is the text in the Scalitzes. Constantinos was unwilling to proclaim Michael IV as emperor. So another eunuch was now sent to Delasanos bearing the holy woods. We've seen the Limburg Starotiki with the holy woods, the Holy Mandelion, Christ's autograph letter to Abgar. We've seen the arrival of that, and the icon of the Mother of God. Now this is the image that goes with that. So you see this golden casket being carried in diplomacy. So they're showing the Holy Mandelion to persuade a reluctant, very powerful eunuch to follow the emperor. Michael IV was a very maverick emperor. He'd married Zoe, who was the empress, and had killed her previous husband, who was the emperor. So he was not necessarily Mr. Popular. Now, Mark's talking about this, the Hungarian Prayer Codex, which dates to 1193 to 95. And you can see here this incense burns here. And this is clearly shown in the Hungarian Prayer Codex. It shows Christ being laid out for burial. And here is a herringbone weed cloth, which has holes both top and bottom. But the pattern of the holes is identical to the pattern that is seen on the shroud. Now, I've tried to argue that this is the event in which that incense damage happened, the date, the time, the place, the reason. Now, this cloth here, it's a flat cloth with a three-dimensional head, rather like the Holy Mandelian image. But it would be about 7 foot by 1 foot, 1.5 foot, which would fit the shroud folded into 4 when it's damaged by incense. Now, this image has been misclassified, in my opinion, in the text. It's in the section attached to Leo V, who died in 820, and it says that this is the army who are burying Leo V. Now, the problem with that is Leo had his head cut off, he had his arm chopped off, and he was hacked to pieces and thrown out into the snow. And the other problem with this is the Varangian Guard. And that's uncontroversial. This is the Varangian Guard, the Kievan Rus, who arrived in Constantinople in 988 AD. So that's 168 years after the death of Leo V. So this is not Leo V, but is it the shroud? Well, I've gone through every text, every other death of an emperor that happened, and there is no other incident that this could reliably cover, in my opinion. Now, there's a text that says this: because there was a drought and no rain had fallen for 6 months, so this is a dire emergency, the brothers of the emperor, Michael IV, held a litany. John carried the Mandelian, I would argue the Karamian, Constantine carried Christ's letter to Abgar, and George the Holy Shroud. The procession advanced from the palace, where we know that the Holy Mandelian was stored in a golden casket, to the Blanchenoid church. Now, this is the only image that accompanies that text. And it seems to me that if the Holy Mandelian is shown in a previous image, why is it not shown in this? It's clearly not there, isn't it? This is a procession of priests. So I would want to argue that these two images once belonged together. This is the procession of priests, and the images were separated by the scribe who copied the original manuscript. The manuscript was divided up, and it's copied by 6 or 7 different types of artists in different styles. So notice the three-dimensional head that's both on the Holy Mandelian image and on the Varangian Guard image. Now, Robert de Clary wrote that the church of St Mary Blanchenoid, there was the shroud. So this is the church to which the procession was going. There was the shroud in which our Lord had been wrapped, which every Friday raised itself upright so that you could see the figure of our Lord on it. And John Jackson has argued that it wasn't just the face that was shown, it was the face down to the hands, where you get the Christ as the Man of Sorrows image. Now, this is a bit of British history, which I absolutely love. Harald Hardrada, who was the King of Norway, was the commander in the Varangian Guard in the 1030s. Now, here he is portrayed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, where he died. You can see that the axe that he's carrying is exactly the same. This is a very time-specific axe. In fact, you can see the same axe held by the army of Harold Godwinson, Harold I of England, who you see the same axe in the Bayeux Tapestry from the events of 1066. Now, in 1066, Harold died alongside Tostig, who was the husband of Judith of Flanders. Now, Judith created this gospel and gave the blood collected from the side of Jesus to the centurion, from the centurion Longinus to Weingarten, Germany, where it's still today present, and every year it's taken on a procession around the city. So let's have a look here just at the minute. This is a very ancient image from 1030 to 1095. Can you see that there's a clear knowledge that the right-sided wound, the face is very shroud-like, you get the divided beard, the long hair, and you get this V on the center of the chest, and you get long toes. And yet this is predating the sack of Constantinople by, I don't know, 100 to 200 years. Now, Judith's great-grandson was Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, and he created this armlet, which is to my mind, truly beautiful. And you can see again the shroud-like face of Christ. You can see the long hair, and you can see the V on the center of his chest, and you can see the long toes. You can see the right-sided spear wound again. And here is the parallel armlet that goes with it. One shows the crucifixion, the other shows the resurrection. And here you get Christ rising out of his tomb, carrying his shroud. So I'd like to argue that there's lots of things in history that would point to the shroud being the Holy Mandelion, and to the Holy Mandelion being the Shroud of Turin. So I think that's my last slide.
All right, awesome. Let me just take it out of cinema mode. All right, cool. So thank you so much for that. I'll just ask some of my follow-up questions first before I turn it to Teddy for her take. Okay, so one thing, so the Abgar legend I wanted to ask you about, because so this is something that is controversial. I remember Jack kind of challenged you on a little bit on this during the panel.
Yes.
So according to secular history, it's Abgar the Eighth, who's around 200 AD, who's converts to Christianity and stuff like that. So you're kind of relying on a legend that it was Jesus was communicating with Abgar the Fifth, and the shroud was transferred to him. He presumably became Christian. So like, what do you make about this kind of alleged discrepancy? Like, how do you deal with that?
Well, I think that if it's Jesus writing the letter, then it must be a contemporary of his. So I would want to go for a king that was ruling at the time Jesus was alive. And I think that given the significance, I mean, you've got the eyewitness account of Egreria in the 4th century saying that this letter is held in great significance. And then you get an 11th century historian actually not just saying it arrived in Constantinople, but drawing a picture of it. And then you see it being used both in the persuasion of Delacinos to come and support Michael IV, and then again it's used in the procession to go to the Church of St Mary Blanchardine. So I think it is a reality, and the reality of what people were writing about was that this is a letter that Jesus wrote via a scribe. So I would take that back to the 1st century.
Gotcha. Perfect. Okay. The other one, I was hoping you were going to keep your slides up there, because I didn't write down. It was you mentioned there was a picture across. It was right before you got into the Fred Barbo. I couldn't get the name.
Oh, Frederick Barbarossa. Yes.
It was the one right before that. And you mentioned one of the things that you mentioned is the long toes.
Yes.
I looked at the woman who was also there, and she also had the same thing. So
long toes. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe am I being fanciful here? This is Judith.
Are you sharing? Hang on 1 second.
So this one here.
So you need to.
I think this is probably. I'm not sure who, which of the gospel writers this is.
So Pam, you need to share your screen again.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I do. How do I do that again? Remind me.
So
I'm not very technological. Share screen.
No worries. Yep, share screen
and then do I go window? Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
And okay.
Share.
There it is.
So can you see that there? How do you want me to do? Do you want me to do it full screen?
Yep. So go ahead.
How do I do that again? Slideshow. Play from current slide. There you go.
So okay. So this one on the right, the green and red.
Yes.
Like look at her toes. It looks exactly the same. So it kind of just looks like it's convention.
Well, that's yes, maybe, but it's just one example, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? I don't think you can argue that just because someone else has it, it isn't true for Christ.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. The other thing I wanted to ask, so this was a question that Jack.
Should I come out of it, or?
Yep, you're good to go if you wanted.
Okay, great.
So the other question I wanted to get a little bit more details, because it was something you and Jack were debating, and I actually kind of saw Jack as raising a valid point here, but it's okay. So if it is the image of Edessa, the shroud is the image of Edessa. It's obviously in Edessa at the time these Justinian coins are being made in around 692 to 695, and
Yeah.
at that time, the Byzantines and Islamic or Arabic forces have
Yes.
been in a war for decades. They took over Edessa. So his point is that it would be unlikely that the Muslims of Edessa, even if they were tolerant of the Christians that were subjects under them, would allow Byzantine engravers to come in and study the shroud to make these coins. So I just wanted to kind of get your response on that,
Okay.
because I found it interesting.
So, I mean, I think I would point to, so I was trying to look up the time, actually, the date when, I would point to the Second Council of Nicaea, so which is about 720s. So partly because of the rise of Islam, but also because it happens, the Reformation was also a period of iconoclasm. And people are afraid that by venerating images, there's a risk that you're contravening the commandments. So there was a period of iconoclasm, and the church in the Nicene Council, they decided to send St. John Damascene to Edessa so that he could look at this image not made by hands, the Holy Mandelion, and make a judgment on whether it was appropriate to destroy images or whether it's appropriate to continue with it. And he was allowed access to the cloth in the 8th century. He's written some actually fantastic hymns about resurrection and about light. But he came back to the council and said that in the same way that the beauty of nature draws our hearts to God, so the icon draws our hearts to Christ. And so that was one of the turning points. There's quite a lot actually in the Scarlitzis about iconoclasm. But so that was one of the turning points. So I would try to argue that actually the Muslim owners, if you want to call it that, the custodians of the Holy Mandelion, did allow people to come and look at it.
Gotcha. All right, cool. So last question from me, and then it'll be over to you, Teddy. But just kind of a general methodological one, because obviously, as we saw in the show, there are alternative histories. Jack Mark Wart represents one, but there are others as well. So,
Yeah.
I just wanted to kind of ask, in terms of general methodology, how should we go about deciding? Is there a way to discern between them? Are they all equally probable, or what's your take on dealing with alternative theories?
I mean, I think it's really difficult. I don't want to, suggest that somebody's wrong or that, do you know what I mean? I do think there's a lot of evidence that the most sacred and significant cloth that bore the image of Christ was the image of Edessa. And I think what I've tried to show is that, after its arrival, we get images of ivories that look identical to Jesus on the shroud, the Shroud of Turin. We get, I would argue that you've got evidence of when it was damaged by incense during this period. You know what I mean? And
yeah.
So yeah, but again, I think it's one of those interesting mysteries about the shroud that we may never get back to. Its actual, we might never be able to absolutely pin down a history. Partly because, so the Madrid Scarlitzis, which is the text I was dealing with, is the only illuminated text that survived after the sack of Constantinople. So huge amounts of information were just destroyed in an act of sort of wanton vandalism, and other bits like the Limburg Starotiki, which should belong in Constantinople, were taken to, spread out all over Europe. So,
Gotcha. All right, cool. All right, cool. So, Teddy, I want to turn it to you. Now, before you ask your questions to speak with Pam about her presentation here, I just want to turn to you. What is your take about this? Take about five minutes or so and just kind of explain where are you coming from on the Shroud's history during this period. And you have to unmute yourself, just so you know.
There we go. So as y'all were talking about the whole issue as to how could a Byzantine artist and how did they see the shroud in order to make the coins, what we have to look at is, in terms of the timeline, the Byzantine Empire began in 330 AD, and the Muslims conquered Edessa at 639 AD, and the first coin was struck in 685 AD. So my answer to that is you've got between 330 AD at the start of the Byzantine Empire all the way to 639 for at least one person to have depicted the shroud in a painting, which I can tell you, I dabble with art and creating art. And one of the things when I'm done with my book, I want to do a painting of the shroud, the Holy Shroud. That is something that I think almost a lot of religious people who are also artists, when they start to really appreciate what the Holy Shroud, you want to depict it. And there's just no way that in all of that time there weren't numerous artists who were creating paintings of the shroud. So and honestly, people argue that the artist that drew the image that we see in the Hungarian Prayer Codex, that he must have seen the shroud. Well, actually, I think that the evidence is stronger that he didn't see the actual shroud. I believe that he saw a painting of a shroud done by somebody who saw the shroud. And maybe there were several people. The reason why I think this is because one of the problems that skeptics have brought up about the image in the Hungarian Prayer Codex with the burn marks, with the L shape, I agree with Pam and Mark. That is not a coincidence. It's in the right place. It's shaped just like it. That's just not a coincidence. But there's the issue that we see those little holes in, I think it was the angel wings elsewhere in the depiction. So then I remember when I first saw that, I was like, oh gosh, well, that, then it opens it up to the argument of are the little circles in the shape of an L, is that just a fluke? Which is so hard to imagine. But, let's just give the devil his due and say, okay, there's strong evidence, given that you have those same little circles in the angel wings, that it looks like it's just a design. But you know what? Here's the thing. It's not a design if whoever created this image on the Hungarian Prayer Codex saw the little circles in somebody else's image and they were thinking, what is that? Is that a design? And they just then replicated those little circles elsewhere to kind of carry out the theme of the design of the circles. They might not have realized the significance of those circles. And so they were just blindly copying what they were seeing. So for example, with the fold mark in the shroud near the neck, and you have that being replicated in art, and some would argue, and I think that it in some, at least in some images, I think there's a good argument for that. Not all images, but in some. But there might be some people who come along who don't really know so much about the details of the Holy Shroud, to where they just see that image and they're making a copy, and then they just put a line in there, and then they maybe put a line somewhere else, just, you know, a variation on a theme. So so I think that idea kind of trumps the idea that the L-shaped holes are a fluke. But in order for that to be the case, it's got to be where the person that did the Hungarian Pro-Codex was copying from a copy that somebody else, or maybe several other people down the line, had copied. And so things got a little skewed. And I know that Hugh has argued that, oh, that's not a herringbone weave on, and I'm like, if you're an artist and you're doing an impressionistic thing, yeah, that is a great, you know, depiction, not dead on, but if you're going to just kind of do a quick sketch of what a herringbone weave looks like, that's pretty close. But so anyway, so with the coins, I think that we have all of these centuries in between where the Byzantines are in control and prior to Muslim control of Edessa. And now we have to go back to the Abgar legend. You know, I do believe that there is a whole lot of truth to the legend of Abgar. Now, whether some things have been added into the mix, you know, quite possibly. But I think at its root, it's rooted in truth. Now, one of the interesting things is to point out is Acts 19:11 through 12, where it said, or says, God was performing extraordinary miracles by the hands of Paul, so that handkerchiefs or aprons were even carried from his body to the sick, and the diseases left them, and the evil spirits went out. Now, if that's not just pretty much a cookie cutter case of what is being described to us with the Abgar legend, that he puts, you know, the cloth to his face and then he's healed. I mean, there are a lot of people say he had leprosy. That's not for sure. It's some serious ailment, the best of what my research is, but it's not been specified. But that's beside the point. When we get into the Abgar legend, there's also, again, I am such a huge fan of Gregory Referendarius's sermon. It's an embarrassment of riches what is contained in that sermon. And a lot of times in Shroud scholarship, we just see little blurbs. And I'd like to point out, for example, Gregory says that Christ had said that wherever 3 people are gathered together in my name, their witness is sure. And Gregory points out that there were 3 patriarchs who have declared that this is an image of Christ, which was brought from Edessa in the year, and they give the, so what is it, Seleucid, or I'm butchering that word. But, so yeah, that year of 6452, but that when you calculate it into AD, that's 944 AD, which is of course when the image of Edessa was brought to Constantinople. And so that, which was brought from Edessa in the year 944 due to the zeal of a pious emperor. And here's some more things of what Gregory said. He says, for how can something be incredible if it can be understood? The corresponding dignity is to believe the object exists and to praise it beyond reason. But then he goes, and then he says, he refers to the cloth as something by which what cannot be made is said to have been made. And then this, ace in the hole, this is it right here. He states with regard to the image of Edessa that it is therefore enough to worship what it is, and not for somebody to think that it can be subjected to reason as if it were not so. mere relics
No.
are not worshipped.
No.
Only this image of Edessa, which Gregory points to, it's not just the face, or what some people claim is the Mandelian, where it's just the face. No way, because Gregory points out to seeing the lance wound. So he personally saw it when it was brought to Constantinople the day before. He saw it with his own eyes. And he is saying it should be worshiped. The only reason why it can be worshiped is because the Holy Shroud is a vessel for the sacred blood of Christ. And because it contains that blood, something that was inside of God, a part of God that is now on this sacred cloth, that is the only reason why it can be worshiped. And then,
all right. So finish off. I want you to ask questions as well. So
sure.
Yeah, finish off.
But the other important thing is that with Emperor Constantine, who witnessed when the image of Edessa was brought to Constantinople in 944, he saw it. And this was, of course, before he was emperor, but he got to see it that same day. And how did he describe it? As an extremely faint and more like a moist secretion without pigment of the painter's art. Boom, that's it. The image of Edessa is absolutely, I mean, I just think, just hands down, all of those points. And there's the issue of it, that's the only cloth, that's the only thing that we know historically that came to Constantinople that had this huge fanfare surrounding its coming to the city. Because what would have greater fanfare than having the image of Christ miraculously created without human hands and containing Jesus's blood on it? I mean, it's just mind-blowing. So anyways, I, as you can tell, I'm a little partial to the image of Edessa being the Shroud of Turin. Just a little.
Just a little. Awesome. All right, cool. Well, Teddi, obviously now turning to Pam, since what did you make of her presentation? Do you have a few questions for her?
Yeah. No, I mean, I thought that was really, really interesting. And I mean, I think the text reads that when I can't remember that it's Romanos himself who's kissing it, or whether it's his I can't remember whether it's a delegate he sends, but I think the text does say he worshipped it. And you know, basically, are you saying if it isn't the Shroud of Christ, if it isn't the Shroud of Turin, then what you're talking about is wholesale idolatry by these very, very eminent and extremely intelligent people. You know, to me, Constantine talks about sending his
Archbishop of Hagia Sophia. You know, he's
absolutely. You know, to me, and you know, they knew the penalties. They would have wanted to obey the commandments. They would not be worshiping something.
And another
they didn't feel.
Is we were bringing up iconoclasm, and that's one of the things that Gregory Referendarius does too, which is also spectacular, which I've never heard anybody mention this, and I was surprised as I was reading his sermon. He is basically getting the legend of Akbar and the Acts of Thaddeus and the doctrine of Adai, and he talks about how tradition and history, how they're basically like sisters, and he is trying to explain how the legend of Akbar, where it's got a lot of reality to it, but over time it has gotten some legendary features to it, but he's trying to show how it connects to what was brought to Edessa the day before his sermon. And one of the interesting things is that when you look at the legend of Abgar, Eusebius does not, you know, he was the first person to discuss that, or that we have written accounting of the legend. He does not mention that there is any type of an image. Whereas in the later texts with the doctrine of Adi and the Acts of Thaddeus, we have an image. But one of the things, so there's a question is did the image part get added on later? But here's an interesting thing to think about. Eusebius was an iconoclast. So he might have omitted that part just because you're talking about the image of God and he thinks that you can't display it. And so he may have just, I think there's a good argument to be made that he left it out because of his own biases and didn't want to promote people being iconoduals.
Yes,
So Teddy, did you?
But I think as well. Sorry,
Mhm.
I think as well. Sorry, no, I keep interrupting you.
Okay, Pam, say what you want to say, but also
I was going to say that I think Mark raised it last week that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence.
True.
The fact that somebody doesn't mention something doesn't mean it's not a reality.
Mhm.
Can I just go back? Can I just go on screen share just a minute ago and just have a look at the Pray manuscript again, if you don't mind?
Yeah, you've actually got it up right now, so it's been shared this whole time. So,
has it been up the whole time? Because if you have a look at it, I think it's very unkind to say, okay, can it go onto full screen? How do I do that?
it's on cinema mode, so yeah.
So play from current side. There you go. If you look at it, I think it's very unkind to say that the angel wings have holes in them. The angel wings have a pattern of holes, yes. And this here, which presumably is Mary, has a pattern of holes going across here. It's very different from this. Very different. This is particularly stylized as a different, do you know what I mean? If it was just a pattern, you'd find it was here and here and here and here. Do you know what I mean? But it isn't.
Even Hugh Ferry agreed with that, right? So yeah, I totally see what you're saying. This is not a decorative pattern.
It's not decorative. Whereas I would say the angel wing is definitely decorative. It's just
Right, but that's where I think that it was somebody making this from a copy to where they see the L-shaped legit things and they're thinking that maybe that's a pattern of sorts, and then they decide to just continue the theme in some other areas. I mean, because like I said, I do believe that it's too incredible that it's shaped like an L and in the right spot. And you've got this herringbone weave, and I think that the red crosses are symbolic of blood. I mean, there's just too much to think this is all just a fluke. But I think that that's how you explain those little circles, because I remember when I first heard that argument, I think it was the guy Allen that brought that up in that debate that you had, Dale, with him, and I was like, oh, well, that is a little bit of a problem. But then if you think about somebody copying from a copy and they don't realize the significance, then that makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the one question mark I'd ask about that is that I did some research when I was looking into Judith and Tostig and Harold Hardrada, and there's definitely interrelationship between the Byzantine rulers and the Hungarian rulers. So I think Bella the Third was married to one of the Byzantine princesses. So it's conceivable that envoys from Hungary would have seen the shroud.
It's extremely, I remember a while back when I was doing some research on the issue, I was pleasantly surprised. I didn't realize how much of a connection there was. So I would say that the odds are extremely high that they would have seen it.
They would have seen
access to it.
But also going back to the argument I was trying to make last week is what I've tried to argue is that here's some evidence that the incense burn marks existed by 1190. Okay, so we're looking for an event that happened before 1190. That image I showed you is most definitely the Varangian Guard. And I've done quite a bit of research into the impact the Holy Mandelion had on the conversion of Russia and Ukraine, which has been particularly poignant in the light of the war. So Vladimir the Great, who sent the Varangian Guard to Constantinople in 988 as part of a marriage agreement to marry Anna, who was the sister of the Emperor Basil II. She would only marry him if he became a Christian. He was a terrible man. We won't go into his history, but so and so he became a Christian, and she went to live with him and took priests with her, and the conversion of Russia and Ukraine happened. And he baptized the entire Ukrainian, Kievan Rus in the river. And so the impact, and if you look at the art that came out of Ukraine and Russia at that time, so early 11th century, you get shroud-like images in the cathedrals. The Novgorod icon, which is 1100 AD, is a shroud-like image from Russia. Very, very early. So, I mean, I think that the significance, going back to the argument I was trying to make, is I'd like to see the history that points to the shroud being damaged by incense post 1355. I want to see the date and the time and the impact and the history that tells that happens. You know what I mean? Because what I'm trying to do is say, here is a plausible explanation for when that event happened, which is documented in history. So I mean, which had a really powerful impact on Harald Hardrada, took Christianity, built churches in Norway. You know, you get Judith and Tostig in England. You know, it's spread all over Europe. Amongst the elite, amongst the royal families, you know, I'm not saying that the general populace actually saw much of the shroud until it was shown as the Man of Sorrows at St Mary Blanchard.
I was going to ask you. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, Karen.
Oh, I was going to ask you, with the whole 3D head in the illuminated manuscripts in the Madrid Scalitzes. Why do you, I mean, I have my own little theory as to why the head is three-dimensional, whereas the rest of the cloth is not. I mean, but do you have any theories as to why that's the case? Because obviously the Holy Shroud does not have a three-dimensional, you know, head on it, you know, literally.
I mean, John Jackson might argue against that. I mean, do you know what I mean? It is a three-dimensional image, isn't it?
Well,
do you know what I mean? So, I mean, I think it's to point to the fact that it is a cloth, but it is extraordinary, and it has the face of Christ on it. So, I mean, I think that's why it has that. I think they call it plasticity or something like that when it's three-dimensional.
Because what I was gonna say is that when you look at the negative of the Holy Shroud, the face is particularly realistic, and I'm wondering if perhaps that could be why they. Well, but no, they wouldn't have seen. They didn't know that aspect. No, so I'm gonna pierce my own argument there because they didn't know how realistic.
No, I know. And I mean, I do think that's one of the issues for medievalists to address, which is, you know, Napoleon Bonaparte said, forethought we may have, but not foresight. We can't predict what's going to happen into the future. We can't imagine what's going to be invented in 100 years' time. So why would someone have created something that was consistent with photography, which they'd never heard of, or consistent with 3D imagery, which they'd never even begun to imagine? How would they have done it? I mean, I used to joke about this, that in those days, you know, they were using inkgall pens and quills. You know, they sent their letters by horseback or walked. Do you know what I mean? To contemplate the technology whereby we're talking on computers is just and analysing 3D imagery through computers is just beyond the medieval mind.
It may just be, you know, artistic license.
How do you mean?
It may just be artistic license, which, you know, artists have been known to do that, where they decide to just make the face?
Oh, you mean, sorry, going back to the 3D on the
Yes.
Skeletis?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I mean, I think absolutely artistic license. I mean, I think what's interesting about the Varangian Guard image is that the cloth is clearly an emperor wearing a loris, a golden loris, which is representative of the burial cloth of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think the image has been redacted by a copyist, so there's blood around the neck to make it look like Leo V.
Right.
But I just don't. If you look at the Skeletis, there is no other event this could be. There's no every other death of an emperor, apart from one or two exceptions where they're so minor you wouldn't bother, are all documented. You know, they're all dying in bed or having their heads chopped off, or do you know what I mean?
Right. No, I think you made an excellent argument with that.
Oh,
I buy it.
Thank you.
Also, I was good. Yeah, and Teddy, do you have any other? We're at the 2 hour mark. I don't know if anyone has time limits, but Teddy, do you have any other questions related to Pam's presentation there that you wanted to ask her about? Or
No other questions, but I just want to compliment you on an excellent presentation. It's really wonderful, and you always do such great work. I'm a big admirer of your scholarship.
Thank you. Well, but it's worth it, isn't it?
It is.
He's worth it. Christ is worth it. You know, every ounce of energy that we put into understanding the nature of his being and of his image that remains with us, I believe, is worth it.
Mm-hmm. And it brings
you. It is a pearl of great price.
Yes, and I've noticed just the more intensely one studies the shroud, there is this amazing closeness that one gets to God that I don't know that it's possible to get that close with that. I mean, maybe it's possible, but there aren't too many things. I mean, like maybe if a gun is pointed at you, or you know you're about to get gassed in a concentration camp or something horrific like that, and yeah, I imagine you'd be very, very close to God. But in general, I think you can know a lot about God. You can have a tremendous faith, yet there's something remarkably beautiful about not just having faith in God, but having knowledge of God. And the more that one studies the shroud, the more one gets knowledge as to the supernatural realm that points to God. I was going to say, with regard to the blood stain on the forehead, I'm kind of like the little kids. I think it's a 3 that is symbolic of the Trinity, and I believe that that's God, just the imprimatur of God, just boom, stamping it right on the forehead in blood. This is who I am, you know, identifying himself.
Yeah. Sure.
But you know what? But one thing that we see with the Holy Shroud is that many times there are many explanations for the same thing, and so it would not surprise me at all, because that's just, you know, God's pretty clever.
I think there are multiple layers, multiple things to look at.
The complexity of it all. I think it's all actually correct, to be honest with you.
Awesome. All right, cool.
Sorry, just one last thing. I can remember standing in front of the shroud the first time I ever saw it, the real thing. And it went through my mind, you know, that this is the face of God. You know, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace, you know. But it's also the blood of Christ which saves us from our sins, which you were speaking so eloquently about.
I mean, just that I have not yet had the privilege of seeing it in person, and so I'm chomping at the bit for 2025 as I hear that it might be coming. And just the idea of being in the presence of the blood of Christ. And people say, well, you know, I'm Greek Orthodox and it's the Holy Communion, but that's just not the same. The blood of Christ that was shed on the cross, that is the salvific blood that That happened one time, and there's
But I would agree. I would agree with you there. But I'd also say that one of the things I've been most fascinated about is the Eucharistic miracles. So
yes.
Mantua and other places. If you look up the Eucharistic miracles in Buenos Aires, when Pope Francis was the Pope, was the Archbishop there, and you get the same blood group, you get the same red coloration of the Eucharistic. So it is hidden, isn't it, within the sacraments, but it is still the blood of Christ, you know. So
well, that and you know, that is, you know, obviously incredibly special, but to me, there's just something, I mean, in terms of the literal word unique, a one-time thing. The blood that was shed as part of the passion, that cannot be truly repeated. I mean, but so anyway, I look forward to
yes.
really,
and the risen Christ bears those scars,
right?
Still. You know.
Awesome. All right, cool. Well,
absolute privilege, and God bless you with your book, and God bless you with your podcast. They're fantastic. And
thank you. God bless you in your research as well. I'm sure you'll be on another show sometime in the future. So awesome. Very cool.
Thank you.
Thank you to Pam, and thank you, Teddy. So just so the audience knows, so tonight, actually, it's a live show. So tonight at 7, I'm doing my Shroud Wars debate with Jordan from Reasons to Doubt. And he's an atheist, he's a Shroud skeptic, and he's a nuclear engineer. So he's going to be taking me to task on the neutron absorption hypothesis. And we're also going to be debating the Sudarium of Oviedo, which came up here today. So I'm going to be copying I got my notes from Pam's presentation there. So yeah, other than that, have a great week, everyone. And thanks for being here.
Well, as they say, you know, break a leg.
I will try my best. Yeah.
I don't want to wish you good luck, because that's bad luck, right? So break a leg.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, guys.
God bless.
Take care.